5 American soldiers stood frozen at the edge of a German forest, their weapons trained on a scene that defied every briefing, every training exercise, every expectation of war. What they witnessed in that river on April 23, 1945, would force them to confront a question no military manual could answer. What do you do when the enemy stops looking like the enemy? The dense evergreens of the Harz Mountains had swallowed the reconnaissance patrol whole. Corporal James Williams moved with practiced silence, his Thompson submachine gun sweeping left to right as Sergeant David Robinson signaled the advance. Behind them, 3 more soldiers from the 761st Tank Battalion maintained tactical spacing. They had been moving through enemy territory for 6 hours, following coordinates provided by military intelligence with instructions that were unusually specific. Locate and secure high-value targets in the vicinity of an evacuated research facility. The sound reached them before the visual. Water moving over rocks. Then voices distinctly female speaking rapid German. Robinson's fist shot up, the universal signal to halt. Every man dropped to a knee, weapons ready. In the final weeks of the European war, sounds could mean anything. Displaced civilians, Wehrmacht deserters, SS units preparing an ambush. Female voices meant nothing in terms of threat assessment. German women had been documented firing Panzerfausts, manning anti-aircraft batteries and setting booby traps. They moved forward in a tactical line, using the undergrowth for concealment. The river came into view first, a clear tributary maybe 30 feet across, moving swiftly with spring snowmelt from higher elevations. Then the clearing, then the women, 6 of them, in various stages of bathing in the cold water, ages ranging from what looked like mid-20s to early 40s. The soldiers' training took over automatically. Scan for weapons, check the perimeter, identify threats. But the cognitive dissonance hit like a physical force. These women weren't combatants. They weren't even dressed. On the riverbank sat quality leather cases, carefully protected from the water, clothing that wasn't the typical refugee rags, and something else, something that would change everything. Technical papers visible through an open case. Nobody moved. The women hadn't seen them yet. Robinson's mind raced through the tactical calculus. His orders had been clear. Identify targets of scientific or intelligence value. Secure them. Prevent their capture by Soviet forces advancing from the east. But nothing in those orders had prepared him for this moment, for this fundamental disconnect between mission parameters and human reality. Williams saw it first. He had studied engineering for 2 years at Tuskegee before the draft, had always paid attention to details. The papers in that case weren't personal letters. They were technical diagrams, schematics. His eyes tracked to the women's hands as one reached for soap on the bank. Ink stains, chemical burns on the fingertips. He had seen hands like that before, in the university laboratories. These were the hands of people who worked with chemicals and calculations. The decision point lasted maybe 15 seconds, though it felt eternal. Robinson made the call. He stood up, weapon lowered but ready, and stepped into the clearing. His movement triggered immediate panic. The women turned, saw the American uniforms, saw the black faces, and several screamed. Hands went up instinctively. One woman stumbled backward into deeper water. "English," Robinson called out, his voice firm but not threatening. "Does anyone speak English?" For a moment, only the sound of the river. Then one woman, mid-30s with dark hair plastered to her shoulders, raised her hand higher. "I speak English. Please. We surrender. We want to surrender to Americans." Robinson gestured for his men to spread out, establish a perimeter. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The woman's English was heavily accented but clear. "My name is Dr. Margaret Schilling. We are research chemists from Berlin Institute. We were evacuated when facility was bombed. We are walking west, trying to reach American lines before Russians." Williams moved closer to the leather cases, his weapon still ready. He could see the documents more clearly now. Equations, engineering diagrams, measurements and calculations in precise technical German. "These are rocket calculations," he said, looking up at Robinson. "Propulsion mathematics." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Dr. Schilling's expression shifted from fear to resignation. "Yes. We worked on propulsion systems. We are scientists. We had assignments." "For the V2 program?" Williams pressed. "The rockets that hit London? That killed civilians?" Silence. Another woman spoke from the water, older, her voice harder. We calculated fuel ratios. We optimized thrust equations. We were given problems to solve, and we solved them. This is what scientists do. Private Thomas Jefferson, the youngest member of the patrol at 20 years old, spoke up from his position on the perimeter. "Sarge, what are we doing? These are Hitler's scientists. They built the weapons." Robinson felt the weight of command settle on him like a physical burden. His orders were unambiguous. High-value intelligence targets were to be secured and protected. The brass wanted these people. The U.S. military intelligence apparatus was in a desperate race with the Soviet Union to capture German scientific expertise. But standing here, watching these women shiver in the river, seeing the fear in their eyes, the simple moral clarity of follow orders collided with something more complicated. To understand how these 5 Black American soldiers ended up in this impossible situation, you have to go back. Not just days or weeks, but years. You have to understand who they were, what they had fought through, and what made this moment so uniquely painful. The 761st Tank Battalion had been activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. It was a segregated unit in a segregated army, part of a military that reflected the deep racial divisions of American society. The men who joined came from every corner of Black America. Sharecroppers' sons from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Howard and Tuskegee. They came because their country called, even though that country treated them as second-class citizens. Training was rigorous. The Army needed tank crews, but it didn't necessarily believe Black men could perform the role. The men of the 761st had to prove themselves daily, had to exceed every standard just to be considered adequate. They trained on M4 Sherman tanks, learning gunnery, mechanics, tactics, and coordination. Their white officers were a mixed group, some believers in their men's capabilities, others resentful of the assignment. They adopted the motto, "Come out fighting," and the nickname Black Panthers, decades before the term would take on different connotations. In October 1944, they shipped out to France and were attached to General George Patton's Third Army. Patton, for all his flaws, was a pragmatist. He needed tanks, needed them desperately, and he didn't much care what color the crews were if they could fight. And fight, they did. The 761st entered combat on November 8, 1944, and would spend 183 consecutive days in action. They fought through the brutal hedgerows of France. They held positions during the desperate winter of the Battle of the Bulge, when German panzers nearly broke through Allied lines. They punched through the vaunted Siegfried Line, the fortified barrier Germany had built along its western border. They fought with distinction, with courage, with a determination born from knowing they represented more than just themselves. But they also fought with the bitter knowledge of what waited for them at home. Many came from southern states where they couldn't vote, couldn't eat at the same restaurants as whites, couldn't use the same water fountains. They wore the uniform of a nation fighting fascism abroad while practicing apartheid at home. When they got passes to nearby towns, they sometimes found white American soldiers treated them worse than the liberated Europeans did. By April 1945, the war was clearly ending. German resistance was collapsing, but the fighting remained intense and deadly. It was in this context that Sergeant Robinson's reconnaissance patrol received unusual orders. They were to move ahead of the main advance into territory that might still contain enemy forces, and locate what intelligence described as dispersed research personnel of potential value. The briefing had been vague, deliberately so. Robinson and his men weren't told about Operation Alsos. They didn't know that since 1943, the United States had been running an increasingly frantic campaign to capture German scientists before the Soviet Union could get them. They didn't know that teams of military intelligence officers, scientists, and specialized troops were racing across Germany with target lists of researchers, laboratories, and technical facilities. What they knew was their orders: find these people, secure them, radio for support, and prevent their capture by Soviet forces. It was reconnaissance work, the kind their unit had done dozens of times. They just didn't know yet what finding the targets would actually mean. The roots of Operation Alsos reached back to the darkest fears of the Allied scientific community. In 1939, when news reached America that German scientists had successfully split the uranium atom, Panic set in among physicists who understood the implications. Albert Einstein, himself a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, wrote his famous letter to President Roosevelt, warning that Germany might be developing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was America's response, a massive secret program to build the bomb first. But the Manhattan Project existed in a fog of uncertainty. How far along was German atomic research? What other scientific breakthroughs might they achieve? Germany had been the world's leading scientific nation before the war. German universities had produced more Nobel Prizes than any other country. German chemical companies were the most advanced in the world. German engineering was legendary. When that scientific establishment was turned toward military applications, what might they create? Operation Alsos was formed to find answers. The name itself was a kind of insider joke, the Greek word for Groves, a reference to General Leslie Groves, who commanded the Manhattan Project. Teams were assembled with an unusual composition: military intelligence officers for security, combat troops for protection, and scientists who could evaluate what they found. Their mission was simple in concept, but enormously challenging in execution: get to German scientific facilities before they were destroyed, capture the researchers, secure the documents, and prevent anything from falling into Soviet hands. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in 1944 and 1945, Alsos teams followed close behind. They hit university laboratories in France and Belgium. They captured research facilities in occupied territories. They interrogated scientists and technicians, always asking the same urgent questions. Where is the atomic research? Where are the scientists? What has been evacuated, and where did it go? What they discovered was both relieving and alarming. The German atomic program had never achieved the focus or resources of the Manhattan Project. They weren't close to a bomb, but in other areas, German science was breathtakingly advanced. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 ballistic missile represented technology years ahead of anything the Allies had. German jet aircraft were faster than anything in the Allied arsenal. Their submarine designs were revolutionary. Their chemical industry could produce compounds that didn't exist anywhere else. And much of this work had been done, not in the stereotypical image of the lone male genius, but by teams that included large numbers of highly educated women. This was partly necessity. Germany had drafted most of its young men to fight, creating labor shortages even in technical fields. But it was also a reflection of a less-known reality. The Nazi regime, despite its regressive ideology, had pragmatically used women in roles that other nations reserved for men when it served the war effort. These women scientists, engineers, and technicians worked across the German military-industrial complex. At IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, women chemists developed synthetic materials and compounds. At Siemens, women engineers worked on electronics and guidance systems. At the sprawling Peenemünde facility on the Baltic coast, women mathematicians and physicists contributed to the V-2 rocket program. They weren't the public faces of these projects. Men like Wernher von Braun got the attention, but they were essential to the work. By early 1945, as Allied bombing intensified and Soviet forces approached from the east, the German government began evacuating these facilities. Universities in Berlin, Hamburg, and other cities dispersed their research institutes to remote locations. Private companies moved operations to salt mines, caves, and forests. The goal was to preserve the research, the equipment, and the personnel until, somehow, the war could be won, or at least a negotiated peace achieved. This created a unique situation. Small groups of highly educated, highly valuable people were scattered across rural Germany, often without significant military protection, trying to survive the war's final chaos. For Allied intelligence, they represented an unprecedented opportunity. For the scientists themselves, it was a dangerous limbo. And for the Soviet Union, advancing rapidly from the east, they were prizes to be collected. Stalin's orders to his commanders were explicit and ruthless. Capture German scientists, engineers, and technicians by any means necessary. The Red Army formed special trophy brigades, whose sole job was to identify and seize scientific assets. Soviet intelligence had target lists just like the Americans did. The difference was that Soviet offers to captured scientists weren't really offers at all. You came to work for the USSR, or you disappeared. This created a situation where German scientists, many of whom had worked enthusiastically for the Nazi regime just months earlier, were now desperate to surrender to American or British forces rather than Soviet ones. They knew the Western Allies might interrogate them, might use them, but probably wouldn't make them vanish. The Soviets offered no such comfort. The Harz Mountains, where Robinson's patrol was operating, were a focal point of this competition. The region had been used extensively for dispersed military research and production. The Mittelwerk facility, built inside a mountain using concentration camp labor, had produced thousands of V-2 rockets. Numerous smaller research sites dotted the forested mountains. Intelligence reports suggested that personnel from Berlin institutes had fled to this area. This was the strategic context that put 5 Black American soldiers from a tank battalion into a forest clearing, confronting a group of German women scientists trying to bathe in a river. But to truly understand the weight of that moment, you need to understand what Germany looked like in April 1945. The country was dying. That's not metaphor or exaggeration. The organized state that had conquered most of Europe was dissolving into chaos. Hitler was in his bunker in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. The government had effectively ceased to function. Local Nazi party officials were either fleeing or being lynched by angry civilians. The Wehrmacht was fragmenting, units dissolving as soldiers deserted or surrendered en masse. Civilian infrastructure had collapsed. Allied bombing had destroyed power plants, water systems, and transportation networks. Most German cities were landscapes of rubble. In rural areas there was no electricity, no running water, no functioning postal service, no police, no civil authority. People survived on what they could forage, barter, or steal. The roads were apocalyptic scenes. Millions of refugees streamed westward, fleeing the advancing Soviet armies. German civilians who had lived for generations in what was now Poland, East Prussia, and other eastern territories were being expelled, often brutally. They walked, pushed carts, drove whatever vehicles still had fuel. Columns of refugees mixed with retreating German soldiers, liberated slave laborers walking home, concentration camp survivors, and advancing Allied units. It was Hieronymus Bosch painted on a continental scale. In this environment, small groups of people on the margins of survival did what humans do. They looked for water, food, and shelter. A clear river in a forest represented a lifeline. You could drink it. You could wash. You could rest nearby. For people who had been walking for days or weeks carrying what they could save from their previous lives, finding such a spot was the difference between survival and collapse. The group of women that Robinson's patrol encountered would have been moving for at least a week, possibly more. Their facility, wherever it had been, was either destroyed by bombing or evacuated ahead of advancing forces. They had orders probably to make their way to some rally point or rear area location, but by late April those orders were increasingly meaningless. There was no rear area. There was no rally point. There was only the choice: go west toward the Americans and British, or wait for the Soviets coming from the east. They would have traveled on foot, avoiding main roads where they might encounter retreating German military units who could press them into service, or advancing Allied forces who might be hostile. They stuck to forests and secondary paths. They carried their most valuable possessions: personal documents, some food, and critically, their research papers. These documents represented years of work, but also their only bargaining chip for whatever came next. Reaching the river, they would have seen an opportunity. The water was cold, snowmelt from the mountains, but they needed to wash. They needed to drink. They needed a moment of relief from the desperate flight. So they made the calculation that countless refugees were making. Take the risk, use the resource, hope no one finds you. But someone did find them. Back in the clearing, the standoff continued. Dr. Schilling had partially dressed, maintaining whatever dignity she could while standing in knee-deep water. Robinson had ordered his men to maintain positions but not to approach closer. The tactical situation was secure, no threats in the immediate area. But the decision point remained. "We need to see your documents," Robinson said. It wasn't a request. Dr. Schilling nodded slowly. "Yes, of course. We have nothing to hide. We want to help Americans. We can help you understand the research." Williams moved to the leather cases on the riverbank, keeping his weapon ready. He opened the first case carefully, checking for traps or triggers. Years of combat had made caution automatic. Inside were folders of papers, all in technical German with heavy use of mathematical notation. He pulled out a sheaf and scanned it. Even with his limited German, he could recognize what he was seeing. Propulsion calculations, fuel mixture ratios, thrust-to-weight equations. "This is rocket science," he said, looking at Robinson. "This is V2 program material." Another soldier, Corporal Marcus Washington, spoke from his position watching their back trail. "Sarge, those rockets killed thousands of people in London. Thousands. And were supposed to protect the people who built them?" The moral trap was closing. Robinson knew his orders. High-value intelligence targets were to be secured. In the calculus of military intelligence and Cold War competition, these women and their documents were extremely valuable. The technology they had worked on, the knowledge they possessed, could give the United States advantages in the developing rivalry with the Soviet Union. That was the strategic logic. But Robinson also knew something about moral logic. He was from Mississippi. He had grown up under Jim Crow. He knew what it meant to be judged not by what you did, but by what you were. He knew the bitter taste of watching people escape consequences because they were useful to those in power. And now, he was being asked to be part of that system, to protect people who had served one of history's most evil regimes because they might be useful. Dr. Schilling seemed to sense his hesitation. "We were scientists," she said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. "We solved technical problems. We didn't kill anyone ourselves. We just did the mathematics." "The mathematics that let the rockets fly," Williams shot back. "The mathematics that let them hit civilian targets. You think that doesn't make you responsible?" An older woman, still in the water, spoke in German. Dr. Schilling translated. "She says we had no choice. When the government assigns you to a project, you work on the project or you go to a camp. Maybe your family goes to a camp. This is not America. We didn't have choices. Everyone has choices," Private Jefferson said quietly. "You could have refused. You could have sabotaged the work. You chose to help them." The moral argument could have continued indefinitely, but tactical reality intervened. Washington called out, "Sarge, I hear engines. East of our position, maybe 2 kilometers. Could be Soviet scouts." The decision crystallized. Robinson could debate morality later. Right now, his orders were clear, and the situation was developing. Soviet forces in the area meant he needed to secure these targets and extract them immediately. "Everyone out of the water. Get dressed. Now." His voice carried the tone of command that ended discussion. "Williams, collect all documents and cases. Washington, stay on that back trail. Jefferson, radio base and request immediate transport. Tell them we have high-value scientific personnel. Need extraction ASAP. Dr. Schilling and the other women moved quickly, understanding that whatever uncertainty had existed in the situation was over. They dressed in the practical clothing of people who had been walking for days. Sturdy shoes, layers of worn garments, headscarves. They looked like refugees because they were refugees, just refugees with PhDs in chemistry and physics. While Jefferson worked the radio, his voice low and urgent requesting extraction, Robinson walked over to where Williams was examining the documents. "What have we got?" Williams flipped through several folders. "Propulsion research from what I can tell. Chemical formulas I don't recognize, probably fuel compounds. Engineering specifications. Test data. Sarge, this is high-level stuff. Way above my understanding, but I can tell it's sophisticated. Worth protecting?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. Williams looked at the women, now dressed and standing in a nervous group. He looked at the documents. He looked at his sergeant. "That's above my pay grade, Sarge. But I know what happens if the Soviets get them instead." Robinson nodded slowly. The Cold War had already begun, even if it didn't have that name yet. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was fracturing before Germany even finished surrendering. The Soviet Union and the Western democracies were positioning for the next conflict. In that emerging struggle, German scientists and their knowledge were pawns on the board. The radio crackled. Jefferson reported, "Transport is en route. ETA 40 minutes. They're sending a truck with infantry escort. We're to hold position and keep the target secure. 40 minutes. Robinson set his men in a defensive perimeter. The women sat together on the riverbank, speaking quietly in German. Dr. Schilling approached Robinson cautiously. "May I ask what will happen to us?" "You'll be taken to an intelligence facility. You'll be interviewed. Beyond that, I don't know. Will we be imprisoned? Tried for war crimes? Robinson looked at her. She was maybe 35, educated, articulate. Under other circumstances, she might have been teaching chemistry at a university, conducting peacetime research, living an ordinary academic life. Instead, she had been pulled into the machinery of total war, had contributed her expertise to weapons of terror, and was now trying to negotiate survival in the ruins. I don't know, he repeated. That's not my decision. In your opinion, what should happen to people like us? It was a bold question, almost aggressive in its directness. Robinson considered his response. In my opinion, Dr. Schilling, you and your colleagues made choices. Maybe those choices were constrained, maybe you felt you had no alternatives. But you made them. You put your education and your talents in service of a regime that murdered millions. Now you want protection from the consequences. I don't know if you deserve that protection, but I have my orders, and I follow my orders. That's what soldiers do. Dr. Schilling nodded slowly. Yes, that is what soldiers do. That is what we all did. We followed orders. It's not the same thing, isn't it? You follow orders to protect us. We followed orders to do research. Both of us are part of systems larger than ourselves. Both of us do what we're told. Williams, who had been listening, interjected. The difference, ma'am, is what those orders serve. We're fighting to end the war, to stop the killing. Your orders helped continue it. And now your orders are to save us so we can help your country build better weapons. How is that ending the killing? The question hung in the air, unanswerable because it was fundamentally correct. The soldiers were protecting these scientists, not out of justice or mercy, but because American military planners wanted their knowledge. They would be taken to the United States, given new identities, set up in laboratories and research facilities, and put to work developing rockets and weapons for the next war. Their service to Hitler would be overlooked because they were useful. This was Operation Paperclip in microcosm. The official program wouldn't be fully revealed for decades, but its logic was already operating in April 1945. President Truman had authorized the military to bring German scientists to America. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was compiling lists and making offers. Over the coming years, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians would be relocated to the United States. Their Nazi Party memberships would be whitewashed. Their war work would be reframed as purely technical. They would become Americans, would work on the space program and weapons development, would live comfortable suburban lives. The most famous would be Wernher von Braun, the public face of the V-2 program, who would become the architect of America's space program. But there were hundreds of others, less famous but equally valuable, and while the program focused on men, women with critical expertise were also included. They were interrogated, their knowledge was extracted, and some were brought to America or employed in post-war Germany working for American interests. The engine noise grew louder. Robinson's men tensed, weapons ready, until they confirmed it was American vehicles. 2 trucks appeared on the dirt road, both with white stars painted on their sides. Infantry jumped out, established a perimeter. A lieutenant approached Robinson and saluted. "Sergeant, I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I understand you have scientific personnel?" "Yes, sir. 7 women, documents relating to propulsion research. They surrendered voluntarily, claimed they're chemists from a Berlin institute." Morrison glanced at the group on the riverbank. "Good work, Sergeant. We'll take them from here. You and your men can return to your unit." It should have been that simple. Mission accomplished, hand off the targets, move out. But Robinson found himself hesitating. "Sir, can I ask what will happen to them?" Morrison looked at him with the expression of an officer who doesn't appreciate questions from enlisted men. "They'll be taken for interrogation and processing. Beyond that is classified." "Do you have a problem, Sergeant?" "No, sir, just curious." "Don't be. This is intelligence work. You did your job. Now let us do ours." The women were loaded into the trucks. Dr. Schilling looked back at Robinson as she climbed aboard, her expression unreadable. Within minutes, the trucks were gone, disappearing down the forest road with their cargo of captured knowledge. Robinson's patrol stood in the clearing beside the river. The water continued its endless flow. The forest was quiet again. Jefferson spoke first. "Sarge, did we do the right thing?" It was the question that would haunt many soldiers in similar situations. Robinson didn't have a good answer then, and the men who lived through such moments often didn't find good answers later. "We did our duty," he finally said. Whether that's the same as right, I don't know. They walked back through the forest toward their unit lines. The war would be over in 2 weeks. Germany would surrender unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The 761st Tank Battalion would remain in Europe as part of the occupation force before returning to the United States in 1946. When they came home, there were no parades for black units. The 761st returned to a country still deeply segregated. Many soldiers went back to southern states where they still couldn't vote. Some faced violence from whites who resented black men who had worn the uniform and carried weapons. The idea that military service would lead to civil rights progress was revealed as naive optimism. Change would come, but it would take decades of struggle. The battalion's combat record was extraordinary, but recognition was slow. It wasn't until 1978, 33 years after the war ended, that the 761st finally received the Presidential Unit Citation for their service. Individual medals came even later. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, killed in action in November 1944, wasn't awarded the Medal of Honor until 1997, more than 50 years after his death. The German scientists fared better. The women Robinson's patrol captured, if they were typical of the program, would have been interrogated extensively. Their research would have been evaluated. Those deemed valuable might have been offered positions working for American programs. Others might have been released to return to Germany and pick up what remained of their lives. A few might have faced justice, though that was rare. The uncomfortable truth is that the Cold War superseded justice. In the competition with the Soviet Union, former Nazis became useful. Their expertise in rockets led to ICBMs and the space program. Their chemical knowledge contributed to industrial processes and weapons development. Their engineering experience helped American companies. The moral calculation was brutally simple. They're more useful to us than in prison or dead. This created situations of profound irony. Black soldiers who had fought fascism overseas returned to apartheid at home. German scientists who had served Hitler were welcomed as immigrants and given opportunities many black Americans were denied. A former SS officer might become a respected NASA engineer, while black veterans struggled to use the GI Bill in segregated states. The encounter at the river was one small moment in this larger moral catastrophe. It was the kind of moment that happened thousands of times in the war's final weeks. Soldiers confronting civilians. Civilians confronting their own complicity. Everyone trapped in a situation where there were no clean choices, only various shades of compromise. For the individual soldiers involved, the memory would have been complicated. They had followed orders successfully. They had completed a difficult mission without casualties. By military standards, it was a success, but the human dimension lingered. They had protected people who arguably deserved punishment. They had been instruments of a policy that prioritized utility over justice. This is not to suggest the soldiers should have disobeyed orders. In the middle of a war with Soviet forces in the area, confronted with a complex situation, they did what trained soldiers do. They followed their orders and adapted to circumstances. The critique is not of them, but of the system that put them in that position. The larger historical accounting is still incomplete. Operation Paperclip remained classified for decades. When information finally emerged through Freedom of Information Act requests and journalistic investigation, it sparked controversy. Some defended the program as a necessary Cold War measure that gave America crucial technological advantages. Others condemned it as a moral failure that let war criminals escape justice. Both perspectives have validity. The V-2 technology that the German scientists brought to America did contribute to the space program. Those same V-2s had killed thousands of British civilians and were built by slave laborers who died in horrific conditions. The scientists claimed they were just solving technical problems. The dead in London and the camps might have disagreed. What makes the encounter at the river particularly poignant is the specific identity of the soldiers involved. Black Americans had a unique moral standing to judge the Nazi regime. Hitler's ideology explicitly ranked races, placing black people near the bottom. Nazi propaganda used American racial policies as validation for their own racial laws. The regime would have systematically murdered black people if given the opportunity, as they murdered Jews, Roma, Poles, and others they deemed inferior. Yet black Americans volunteered to fight this regime even while suffering under America's own racial hierarchy. They fought with extraordinary courage despite knowing they would return to discrimination. And when they captured the servants of that regime, they were ordered to protect them for strategic reasons. The psychological burden of this situation is difficult to overstate. Imagine being Sergeant Robinson from Mississippi, where he couldn't vote or eat at a white-owned restaurant, now standing in a German forest protecting Hitler's scientists because his government deemed them valuable. The contradictions weren't just historical abstractions. They were immediate, personal, and deeply painful. This is why the frozen moment at the river matters. It crystallized all the moral complexity of the war's end into one scene. Enemy and ally, victim and perpetrator, justice and pragmatism, all collapsed into confused overlap. The clear moral certainty of fighting fascism gave way to the murky compromises of the emerging Cold War. History often gets simplified in retrospect. World War II becomes the good war, a clear battle between right and wrong. And in the largest sense, that's true. The Allied cause was just. Defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was necessary and right. But within that larger truth were countless smaller moments of ambiguity and compromise. The encounter at the river was one of those moments. For the women scientists, surrender to the Americans meant survival. Many Germans who fell into Soviet hands disappeared into the Gulag system or were executed. By surrendering to American forces and providing their knowledge, these women likely secured relatively comfortable fates. From their perspective, the encounter was salvation. For the American military intelligence apparatus, the encounter represented success. High-value targets secured, knowledge preserved, advantage gained over the Soviets. The documents captured that day might have contributed to American rocket development or chemical research. From the strategic perspective, the mission was accomplished. But for the soldiers who actually stood in that clearing and made it happen, the moral accounting was more complicated. They had done their duty, but duty in service of what? They had protected people who had helped build weapons of terror. They had followed orders that led to outcomes many found troubling. Private Jefferson's question, "Did we do the right thing?" doesn't have a simple answer. In the moment, following orders and completing the mission was the right thing for soldiers to do. In the larger moral sense, a system that prioritized technological advantage over justice was troubling. Both things can be true simultaneously. This is the ultimate lesson of that moment at the river. History is complicated. People are complicated. Right action in one context can be wrong in another. Soldiers can follow orders successfully and still carry moral doubts. Systems can achieve their goals while violating their principles. The 5 soldiers who encountered those women in the river went on with their lives. They returned home, dealt with the challenges of being black veterans in a segregated society, raised families, worked jobs, grew old. Some probably told the story of that day. Others might have kept it to themselves. Most have passed away now, taking their first-hand memories with them. The women scientists dispersed into post-war life. Some probably came to America under Operation Paperclip or related programs. Others returned to Germany and resumed academic careers. A few might have faced legal consequences, though that was rare. They too grew old, and most are gone now. What remains is the historical record, incomplete and contested. We have documents about Operation Paperclip. We have combat records of the 761st Tank Battalion. We have memoirs and oral histories from veterans. We have declassified intelligence files. From these fragments, we can reconstruct what probably happened in thousands of similar encounters. But we can't fully recapture the weight of the moment. We can't feel what Robinson felt when he gave the order to secure the targets. We can't know what Dr. Schilling felt when she saw Black American soldiers emerge from the forest. We can imagine. We can extrapolate from documented accounts, but the lived experience is lost. What we can do is recognize the moral complexity. We can honor the service of the soldiers while acknowledging the troubling nature of their mission. We can understand the desperation of the scientists while not excusing their choices. We can appreciate the strategic logic of Operation Paperclip while questioning its moral foundation. The encounter at the river stands as a symbol of war's final accounting. When the shooting stops and the dust settles, what happens to those who served evil? What happens to those who fought against it? How do we balance justice and utility, punishment and pragmatism, moral clarity and strategic necessity? These questions don't have universal answers. Each person must wrestle with them individually, but they must be asked. The simplification of history into neat categories of heroes and villains serves no one. The truth is more complicated, more human, and ultimately, more important. 5 soldiers stood at a river's edge on April 23, 1945. They witnessed something that confused every category they had been given to understand the world. They made decisions in that moment that followed their training and orders, and they carried those decisions forward into lives that were shaped by service, sacrifice, and the unresolved moral tensions of the world they helped create. That frozen moment, when the weapons were trained but not fired, when orders were followed but doubts remained, when the enemy became human and humanity became complicated, that moment captures something essential about war's reality. It's not the dramatic battles or the clear victories. It's the quiet moments when ordinary people confront impossible choices and do their best to navigate moral terrain for which no map exists. The river still flows through the Harz Mountains. The forest has grown over whatever traces remained of that encounter. The people involved are nearly all gone, but the questions remain as relevant now as they were then. When duty conflicts with conscience, what do you do? When following orders leads to troubling outcomes, who bears responsibility? When yesterday's enemy becomes today's ally, what happens to justice? These questions don't have final answers. They persist because they reflect fundamental tensions in human society. We need order and discipline, but also individual moral agency. We need strategic thinking, but also ethical foundations. We need to win conflicts, but also to remain worthy of victory. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion fought with extraordinary courage for a country that didn't give them full citizenship. They served with distinction despite facing discrimination at every turn. They completed their missions even when those missions created moral complications. They earned recognition that came decades late. They were heroes who had every reason to be bitter, yet most maintained their dignity and their commitment to a nation that had failed to fully honor them. The German scientists navigated their own moral terrain. They made choices under constraint, but they made choices. They contributed expertise to a regime of mass murder. They then sought to escape the consequences by offering that same expertise to the regime's enemies. Some may have felt genuine remorse. Others probably rationalized their actions. Most fell somewhere in between. And in a forest clearing in April 1945, these two groups collided in a moment that neither could have anticipated. The soldiers trained for combat found themselves conducting an intelligence operation. The scientists fleeing catastrophe found themselves facing men they might have considered inferior under the ideology they had served. Both groups were trapped in a situation neither had chosen, playing roles in a drama whose script was written by forces beyond their control. This is the human reality of war's end. Not the triumphant newsreels or the signing ceremonies, but the complicated ground-level encounters where real people confront the consequences of the great historical forces that have swept through their lives. The moment at the river was one of thousands of such encounters, most unrecorded, that collectively formed the transition from war to whatever uncertain peace would follow. What they couldn't know, standing there in that clearing, was how the post-war world would develop. They couldn't know that the alliance with the Soviet Union would collapse into the Cold War. They couldn't know that German rocket scientists would help put Americans on the moon. They couldn't know that the struggle for civil rights would take another 2 decades of activism before yielding major legislative victories. They couldn't know how history would remember them, or if it would remember them at all. They only knew the immediate reality, orders to follow, decisions to make, a moment that demanded action despite moral uncertainty. They did what seemed necessary in that moment, and they lived with the consequences. That's all anyone can do. History judges, but history wasn't standing in that forest clearing with a radio crackling and engines approaching and women looking at you with fear and desperation, hoping you'll be their salvation rather than their doom. The story of that encounter is ultimately a story about the impossibility of clean moral choices in war's chaos. It's about duty and doubt coexisting. It's about following orders while questioning outcomes. It's about human beings trying to navigate impossible situations with whatever moral compass they possess. And it's about remembering that behind every grand historical narrative are countless individual moments like this one, where the complexities of human choice can't be reduced to simple judgments. The soldiers did their duty. The scientists sought survival. Both were caught in systems larger than themselves. Both made choices that matter. And both left us with questions that remain unresolved, because they reflect permanent tensions in human affairs. The river flows on, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its banks. The forest has reclaimed the clearing. The war ended 79 years ago. But the questions persist, as urgent now as they were then, waiting for each generation to wrestle with them anew. If this untold story of courage, complexity, and moral conflict resonated with you, help us bring more forgotten history to light. Hit that subscribe button and join a community dedicated to uncovering the human stories behind the headlines. These soldiers and their impossible choices deserve to be remembered. Drop a like if you believe these stories matter. History isn't just about the famous battles and well-known heroes. It's about moments like this one, where ordinary people faced extraordinary moral dilemmas. And here's a question for you. If you were Sergeant Robinson standing in that forest clearing, what would you have done? Would you have followed orders and protected the scientists or made a different choice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations keep history alive and relevant. What other untold stories from World War II would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments. Your suggestions help shape our content. Remember, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, but those who engage with history's complexity are equipped to face today's challenges with wisdom. Subscribe, like, comment, and let's keep exploring the stories that shaped our world together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.